Unit 11. Adverbial conditional clauses. Types and variations. A conditional clause, commonly known as an if clause, is a subordinate clause that expresses a condition on which the action or situation in the main clause depends. These sentences usually consist of two parts: the conditional clause, introduced by if or its alternatives, and the main clause, which presents the result or consequence of the condition. The relationship established is one of dependency. The truth, occurrence, or validity of the main clause hinges on the fulfillment of the condition expressed in the subordinate clause. The fundamental function of a conditional clause is to qualify the main clause by specifying a circumstance or requirement under which the action of the main clause will hold. For example, in the sentence, "If it rains, we'll cancel the picnic," the main clause, "will cancel the picnic," is contingent upon the truth of the subordinate clause, "if it rains." Conditional clauses can express either real or unreal conditions. A real condition, also called an open condition, describes situations that are possible and plausible in the present or future. For instance, if he asks me, I'll say yes assumes that both the asking and the response are conceivable. In contrast, an unreal condition deals with hypothetical, imagined, or contrary to fact scenarios. For example, "If I were you, I would study more" implies that the speaker is not the person being addressed, and the condition is therefore imagined. Grammatically, these clauses vary depending on time reference and the speaker's perception of likelihood. The zero conditional, using present tense in both clauses, denotes general truths, e.g., "If you heat ice, it melts." The first conditional, using a present tense in the if clause and future tense in the main clause, projects a probable future result, e.g., "If he studies, he will pass." The second conditional employs past tense in the if clause and would plus infinitive in the main clause, expressing improbable or hypothetical present/future conditions, e.g., "If I had a car, I would drive to work." The third conditional, with past perfect in the if clause and would have plus past participle in the main clause, discusses unreal past events and their hypothetical outcomes, e.g., "If you had called me, I would have helped you." Moreover, these clauses reflect various degrees of truth commitment. A real condition is typically truth neutral, meaning it does not assert the truth of the condition or the result. An unreal conditional, on the other hand, often carries negative truth commitment. It suggests that the condition is not fulfilled and that the result is thus not real either. This distinction between factual, theoretical, and hypothetical meaning underpins the structure and use of conditional clauses throughout English grammar. Type 1. If plus present simple plus future. It also referred to as the first conditional, is a grammatical structure used to describe situations that are realistic and possible in the future. The typical form this conditional takes is if plus present simple tense in the conditional clause, followed by will, or another future form, plus infinitive in the main clause. This construction is employed to indicate that a particular result will occur if a certain condition is met. The first conditional is used in scenarios where the condition is seen as plausible or likely. For example, the sentence, "If the museum charges for entry, a lot of people won't be able to visit it," illustrates a typical use of the first conditional. Here, the condition, "If the museum charges for entry," is entirely possible in the future, and the main clause, "a lot of people won't be able to visit it," states the likely consequence. The structure thus expresses a potential outcome that depends on a future event actually happening. While the basic pattern uses the present simple tense in the if clause, variations are permitted. For instance, other present tenses such as the present continuous or the present perfect can be used to give greater nuance. An example is, "If you're coming on the motorway, you'll need change for the tools," where the present continuous "you're coming" signals an anticipated or arranged action. Similarly, the main clause can feature other future forms beyond just will, such as be going to, modal verbs like can, may, or should, depending on the speaker's intent. For example, if the results of the customer survey are favorable, the supermarket is going to introduce a new range, shows the use of be going to in the main clause to indicate a planned future action. It is essential to note that in standard usage, the if clause does not take a future tense form, even though it refers to a future event. Using will in the if clause is generally considered incorrect unless will conveys volition or willingness rather than simple futurity. For instance, the sentence, "If the weather will be good tomorrow, we'll have a picnic," is incorrect under typical grammar rules. It should be corrected to, "If the weather is good tomorrow, we'll have a picnic." However, in a sentence like, "The company will impose sanctions if the workers won't abandon the strike," will and won't are used acceptably to indicate the worker's refusal or unwillingness to act. Beyond straightforward conditionality, the first conditional can serve various pragmatic functions. It may be used to issue commands such as, "If you get home late, don't wake us," or to make offers like, "I'll call the hotel if you don't have time." It can also be used for suggestions or warnings, as in, "Shall we go out tomorrow if the weather's good?" Or, "I'll call the police if you don't leave right now." These variations enhance the expressive range of the first conditional, allowing speakers not only to predict outcomes but also to influence or negotiate future behavior. Furthermore, in formal English, the conditional clause can be expressed without if by inverting should and the subject. This creates a slightly more formal tone, as in, "Should you be less than delighted with our product, we will refund your money immediately." Such constructions are grammatically correct and frequently used in written communication, especially in professional or academic contexts. Type 1 Variation 1. If plus present simple plus modal verb. This type refers to a common alternative structure within first conditional sentences, where instead of using the auxiliary, will in the main clause, a modal verb is used. The basic form of this variation is if plus present simple plus modal verb plus base verb, and it retains the core function of the first conditional, to express a possible future condition and its result. However, this variation allows for a more nuanced expression of possibility, ability, permission, advice, or necessity, depending on the specific modal used. This structure is especially useful when the speaker wants to soften the certainty of the main clause or convey a more specific attitude toward the outcome. For example, the sentence, "If the regime can keep the loyalty of the army, they may retain power," illustrates how the use of can and may allows the speaker to express ability in the if clause and possibility in the main clause. The conditional logic remains intact, but the focus shifts from a single cause and effect prediction, as with will, to a more cautious or qualified outcome. This variation is particularly common with modal verbs such as can, may, might, should, and occasionally must, each contributing a slightly different meaning. For instance, "If you can read this, you're driving too close to me" uses can to express a general condition related to the reader's ability, and the main clause presents the logical consequence. Likewise, in "If the Spanish team continues to do so well, they should win the World Cup," the use of should expresses a strong likelihood or moral expectation rather than certainty. The present simple tense in the if clause signals that the condition is situated in the present or future, just as in the standard first conditional. However, by replacing will with a modal verb, the speaker can better adjust the tone or modality of the statement. This flexibility is particularly useful in contexts where absolute predictions are inappropriate, or where the speaker wishes to introduce a degree of tentativeness, obligation, or recommendation. It is also worth noting that this variation preserves the rule that future forms are generally not used in the if clause. The use of modal verbs in the main clause does not alter this principle. The condition remains in the present simple or another present tense form such as present continuous or present perfect, depending on the context. For example, a sentence like, "If the results are favorable, the committee might approve the proposal," shows how might in the main clause conveys a weaker sense of possibility, while the condition remains grounded in the present. Type 1 Variation 2. If plus should plus imperative/will. This type introduces a subtle but significant variation in the standard first conditional structure by incorporating should in the if clause. The resulting pattern is if plus should plus base verb, followed by either an imperative or a clause with will plus base verb in the main clause. This structure allows for a more tentative or formal tone, expressing that the condition is considered less likely, or simply more speculative, than in the regular first conditional. The use of should in this variation highlights an element of uncertainty or cautious possibility. It conveys that the condition is not expected, but is still possible, and prepares the listener for a contingency plan. For example, in the sentence, "Should you be less than delighted with our product, we will refund your money immediately," the speaker is not asserting that dissatisfaction is expected, but rather preparing for the unlikely eventuality that it might occur. This construction adds a tone of politeness and professionalism, especially useful in customer service, formal writing, or business contexts. This variation also permits the use of an imperative in the main clause, offering instructions or recommendations in response to a tentative condition. For example, "If you should hear any news, please let me know," is a polite and slightly formal way of saying, "If you hear news, tell me." The presence of should emphasizes that hearing news is only a possibility, not an expectation, and the main clause becomes a request or instruction contingent on that uncertain event. An important feature of this structure is that it can also appear in an inverted form, where the word if is omitted and should begins the sentence, followed by an inversion of subject and verb. The inversion adds an extra layer of formality or stylistic elegance, often used in written English or official statements. For instance, "Should you require any further information, do not hesitate to contact us," expresses the same conditional meaning as "if you should require any further information," but in a more polished and formal tone. This inversion is often found in administrative, legal, or institutional contexts where the speaker wishes to sound courteous yet reserved. The inclusion of should in the if clause serves to soften the condition, distancing the speaker from asserting its likelihood or making direct assumptions about it. It is often used to communicate tentative advice, polite warnings, or possible actions, giving it a wider pragmatic function than the straightforward first conditional with if plus present simple plus will. B. If plus should plus future/modal verb. It also allows the structure if plus should plus base verb to be followed by a future form will, or a modal verb such as may, might, can, could, should, in the main clause. This variation retains the basic meaning and time frame of the first conditional, dealing with potential future situations, but introduces a layer of tentativeness or uncertainty through the use of should. The inclusion of should in the if clause signals that the condition is considered possible, but not especially probable, thereby distancing the speaker from committing to its likelihood. This use is relevant when the speaker wants to present the condition as less expected, more hypothetical, or simply courteous in tone. For instance, the sentence "If the printer should break down within the first year, we would repair it at our expense" indicates that the breakdown is not anticipated, but the speaker is preparing a plan just in case it happens. By using should, the speaker implies that the condition is not a normal or likely scenario, but that the consequences have still been considered. This adds a sense of foresight or reassurance, common in customer relations or formal communication. This structure is particularly common in contexts that involve offers, policies, guarantees, or polite warnings, and is often preferred when the speaker wants to be both clear and tactful. For instance, "Should the tickets fail to arrive before the departure date, we would arrange to have duplicates waiting at the airport." This construction conveys professionalism and preparedness, all while subtly implying that such a problem is rare. It avoids sounding alarmist or overly casual, and instead uses formal language to assure the listener of contingency measures. Importantly, the use of modal verbs in the main clause offers a wide range of modal meanings beyond simple futurity. Depending on the chosen modal, the speaker can express ability can, permission may, possibility might, necessity should, or even tentative advice. For example, "If you should decide to leave early, you might miss the announcement" uses might to emphasize the uncertain outcome tied to an already tentative condition. This contrasts with a regular first conditional like, "If you leave early, you will miss the announcement," which makes both the condition and the consequence sound much more definite. Grammatically, This the structure should plus base form. This maintains the clarity and syntactic correctness of the conditional sentence, while enriching it with a nuanced modal layer. An additional feature of this variation is the possibility of inversion, where if is omitted and should begins the sentence. For instance, should you hear from him, please inform us immediately replaces if you should hear from him, and adds a heightened sense of formality or stylistic emphasis found in English. See should at the beginning of a sentence. A notable variation of the first conditional involves the use of should at the beginning of a sentence, forming a conditional structure without the typical introductory conjunction, if. This inversion, often referred to as subject-auxiliary inversion, is a stylistic alternative to the standard if plus should construction and is most commonly found in formal written English. The structure follows the pattern should plus subject plus base verb, and it is functionally equivalent to if plus subject plus should plus base verb. What distinguishes it, however, is its elevated tone and its usefulness in contexts that require clarity, formality, or a degree of rhetorical finesse. The presence of should at the beginning of the sentence preserves the semantic function of marking a tentative or less likely future condition, in line with the other forms of the first conditional. For example, the sentence "should you need assistance, do not hesitate to contact our office" is a more formal version of "if you should need assistance." Both forms convey the same underlying conditional meaning, namely that the action in the main clause will follow only if the condition is met. However, the inversion projects a tone of politeness, professionalism, or deference that is particularly suitable in business communications, public announcements, legal disclaimers, and formal correspondence. This syntactic choice is often paired with imperatives or future/modal verb forms in the main clause, depending on the desired effect. For instance, should you arrive late, you will be asked to wait until the next session uses a standard future form to express consequence, while should any issues arise, contact your supervisor immediately uses an imperative to convey an instruction. In both cases, the conditional remains real and forward-looking, but the use of should and inversion introduces a degree of formality and anticipation, indicating that the condition is not expected to occur but that there is a plan in place if it does. The inverted structure also serves to foreground the condition and make it more prominent, especially in writing where syntactic variation can enhance clarity and stylistic flow. Because the if is omitted, the conditional element becomes more streamlined and compact, though no less precise. Moreover, the formality of this construction often implies a courteous or deferential tone, as in the sentence, "Should you have any concerns, we would be pleased to address them." This usage is especially common in professional or customer-facing settings where the speaker aims to project responsibility and readiness without assuming that the problem will arise. Type 1 Variation 3, Imperative plus conjunction plus main clause, shall/will. This type introduces an alternative conditional structure that begins not with an if clause, but with an imperative, followed by a conjunction like and, or, otherwise, or then, leading into a main clause typically expressed with shall or will. This variation allows the speaker to express a conditional meaning without explicitly using if. Instead, the conditional is implied through the command or instruction given in the imperative, and the result follows through logical consequence. This construction is used primarily in spoken or informal contexts, but also appears in written English, particularly in instructions, warnings, and threats. The underlying logic of this structure is conditional. Performing the action in the imperative clause will lead to the consequence stated in the main clause. For example, in the sentence "do that again and you will be sorry," the speaker issues a directive "do that again," followed by a consequence "you will be sorry," which is conditional on the action being repeated. The meaning is equivalent to "if you do that again, you will be sorry," but the variation allows for a more forceful, urgent, or stylistically direct tone. Similarly, a sentence like "say one more word and I'll call your parents" functions conditionally, warning the listener that their speech will trigger a specific outcome. Here, the use of and serves as a logical connective that carries the force of if, while will expresses the certainty of the consequence. This structure is frequently used to express warnings, threats, or strong recommendations, and its tone can range from stern to humorous depending on the context and the nature of the imperative. Another example is take one more step and you'll regret it, where the imperative take one more step implies a hypothetical action, and the main clause you'll regret it communicates the resulting consequence. The sentence does not require if, because the conditional meaning is embedded in the juxtaposition of the command and the result. A closely related construction uses or to present an alternative result if the imperative is not followed, as in be quiet or I'll send you to your room. This is logically equivalent to if you don't be quiet, I'll send you to your room, but it is more idiomatic and emphatic. The use of shall instead of will in the main clause is less common and generally restricted to more formal or legalistic contexts. For example, return the documents immediately or legal action shall be taken demonstrates a formal, authoritative register, often found in official warnings or regulations. In such cases, shall adds a sense of obligation or inevitability to the consequence. Type 2. If plus simple past plus would. Type 2 conditionals are used to express unreal or hypothetical situations that relate either to the present or the future. The standard grammatical structure for this conditional form is if plus simple past tense in the conditional clause, followed by would plus base verb in the main clause. This construction is central to discussing situations that are either unlikely to occur in the future or that are contrary to the current state of affairs. In both cases, the implication is that the condition described is not true, not real, or is very improbable, but the speaker wishes to explore what would happen if it were. An example of this structure is the sentence, if I won the lottery, I would buy a house by the sea. This sentence suggests that the speaker does not currently expect to win the lottery, but is imagining a hypothetical scenario. The condition in the if clause, if I won the lottery, is unreal or improbable, and the main clause, I would buy a house by the sea, presents the imagined consequence. The past tense in the if clause does not refer to past time in the literal sense, but rather serves as a marker of unreality or distance from factual reality. This distancing function of the past tense is a defining feature of hypothetical meaning. This form also implies present states that are contrary to fact. For instance, the sentence if I were taller, I would play basketball implies that the speaker is not tall and thus cannot or does not play basketball. The verb were is used here for all persons in formal and traditional usage, especially in written or more careful speech, as a part of the past subjunctive mood. Thus, if I were you, is a classic expression of hypothetical advice that continues to follow this form. However, in informal spoken English, many speakers often substitute was for were, saying if I was taller. Instead, while this is increasingly accepted in casual contexts, the formal standard remains were when expressing hypothetical situations. Type 2 conditionals are often used not only for speculative or imagined situations, but also for advice, polite requests, regrets, or expressions of desire. For example, if I were you, I would apologize offers advice, while if we didn't have to work so hard, we could travel so often expresses a regret about a present circumstance. Politeness can be embedded through modal verbs like could or might in the main clause, softening the conditional further, as in if you could help me with this task, I'd be very grateful. These alternatives to would expand the expressive possibilities of type 2 conditionals, enabling speakers to tailor the degree of certainty or obligation involved. It is crucial to differentiate between type 2 and type 1 conditionals, as the choice reflects the speaker's belief about the likelihood of the condition being fulfilled. Compare if he calls, I will talk to him, type 1 future and considered likely, with if he called, I would talk to him, type 2 future and considered unlikely. The shift from present simple to past simple in the if clause marks a change in reality status, from possible to hypothetical or implausible. Type 2 variation 1. If plus were slash was plus would. This variation with the structure if plus were slash was plus would is one of the most recognizable forms of hypothetical expression in English. It belongs to the broader second conditional category and is primarily used to describe unreal, imaginary, or improbable conditions in the present or future, particularly those involving the verb to be. In this variation, were is traditionally used for all grammatical persons, including the singular first and third person, as a vestige of the past subjunctive mood. This form is retained in formal usage and is especially visible in well-established expressions and idioms. Although was is frequently used in informal contexts with first and third person singular subjects, were is still considered more grammatically accurate in formal written and spoken English, particularly when the condition is clearly contrary to fact. One of the most idiomatic and frequent uses of this structure is the phrase "if I were you," which is employed when offering advice, making recommendations, or imagining oneself in another person's situation. For instance, the sentence "if I were you, I would speak to the manager directly" does not reflect reality, but instead presents an imagined scenario where the speaker takes on the perspective of the listener. The function of this construction is not to describe a real possibility, but to offer counsel based on an imagined reversal of roles. The subjunctive form were here emphasizes that the speaker is not actually the other person, reinforcing the hypothetical and advisory nature of the comment. This formulaic expression is one of the most enduring uses of the subjunctive in modern English, and rarely appears with was, even in informal registers, precisely because of its fixed, idiomatic nature. Another formal and somewhat rhetorical variation of this pattern appears in the expression, "if it were not for," which is used to describe a condition whose absence would fundamentally alter the current situation. For example, the sentence "if it were not for her encouragement, I wouldn't have finished the project," acknowledges a crucial condition that sustains a certain reality. Here, the clause "if it were not for encouragement" identifies an ongoing, though hypothetical, dependency, and the main clause imagines a different outcome if that supportive element were removed. The verb "were" in this case reinforces the hypothetical condition that contrasts with the actual state of affairs. It allows the speaker to attribute an effect or result to a specific cause by imagining the situation in the absence of that cause. This construction can also be inverted to achieve a more formal or stylistic tone. "Were it not for" is a common variation that omits "if" and places "were" at the beginning of the clause. For example, "were it not for the volunteers, the event would not be possible," conveys the same meaning as "if it were not for the volunteers," but in a more elevated or rhetorical manner. The inversion highlights the conditional clause and often appears in speeches, formal writing, and persuasive discourse. This syntactic choice reflects the tradition of subject-auxiliary inversion in formal English and adds emphasis to the conditional premise by placing it at the forefront of the sentence. Both "if I were you" and "if it were not for" and its inverted counterpart "were it not for" illustrate the persistent use of "were" as a marker of the subjunctive mood, even in a language that has largely moved away from overt subjunctive forms. These expressions maintain the formal logic of second conditionals, projecting a scenario that is known not to be true, while inviting reflection on what would follow if it were. The consistent use of "were" in these idioms underlines their deeply ingrained grammatical and pragmatic roles in English, conveying politeness, deference, or rhetorical weight in both casual advice and serious hypotheticals. Type 2 Variation 2. If plus past simple plus modal verb. This variation extends the standard second conditional structure by replacing "would" in the main clause with another modal verb such as could, might, or should. The resulting pattern is if plus past simple plus modal verb plus base form, and like the standard second conditional, it expresses unreal, improbable, or hypothetical situations. What distinguishes this variation is the way different modal verbs allow the speaker to express additional meanings beyond the simple hypothetical consequence. These include notions of ability, possibility, necessity, or permission, offering more nuanced ways to reflect on imagined situations or contrary to fact conditions. This variation is particularly useful when the speaker wants to communicate more than a straightforward imagined result. For example, in the sentence, if we had more time, we could finish the project. The modal verb could conveys ability. The sentence imagines a hypothetical situation having more time that does not reflect the current reality and suggests that under such conditions, the speaker and others would be able to complete the project. The use of could emphasizes capacity rather than certainty, which would have indicated. Another instance is if I were better at math, I might become an engineer, where the modal verb might expresses possibility rather than a definite outcome. The speaker is contemplating an alternative present reality and the potential consequence it could bring. The use of might instead of would signals a more tentative or speculative attitude. In this way, might introduces a weaker form of the imagined consequence, suggesting that even if the condition were true, the result is not guaranteed but simply possible. Besides, the modal verb should can appear in the main clause to express a form of mild obligation or recommendation. For example, if he understood the problem, he should take responsibility, implies that taking responsibility would be the right or expected course of action if the person were aware of the situation. This is still hypothetical because the underlying assumption is that he does not, in fact, understand the problem. In addition, the variation allows the speaker to adjust the emotional or rhetorical force of the conditional sentence. While would often expresses a direct hypothetical result, using could, might, or should lets the speaker fine-tune the implication. For instance, the sentence if they trained harder, they might win the championship, presents an outcome as a remote possibility rather than a likely or inevitable one, and avoids overcommitting to a prediction. This form also continues to use the simple past tense in the if clause to mark the situation as unreal or contrary to fact, even though the actual time reference is present or future. The past tense does not signal past time here but functions as a marker of distance from reality, a key feature of type 2 conditionals. Whether the main clause uses could, might, or should, the condition remains speculative or imaginative, and the modal verbs provide a range of expressive options to capture different degrees of certainty, ability, or appropriateness. Type 2 Variation 3. If plus were to slash was to plus would slash modal. This variation expands the expressive range of the second conditional by incorporating the structure if plus were to slash was to plus base verb, followed by would, or another modal verb such as could, might, or should. This variation is particularly useful for describing unreal or hypothetical situations in the future, especially those that are considered unlikely, speculative, or entirely imaginary. What sets this variation apart from the standard second conditional is not only its formal tone, but also its heightened emphasis on the hypothetical nature of the condition. It creates a sense of emotional or rhetorical distance from reality, which is particularly useful in careful reasoning, polite suggestions, or professional discourse. An example of this variation would be, if the president were to resign, the vice president would assume power. The condition expressed by were to resign does not reflect an actual or expected event, but an imagined one whose consequences the speaker wishes to explore. The main clause would assume power follows the standard second conditional pattern, but the use of were to adds a formal speculative tone. This structure is especially common when the speaker wants to highlight the remoteness or seriousness of a hypothetical event. Similarly, a sentence like if she were to discover the truth, she might leave him presents a condition that is both emotionally loaded and hypothetical, with might introducing a less than certain result. In informal spoken English, was to is sometimes used instead of were to, particularly with singular third-person subjects. For example, if he was to win the award, he'd be thrilled conveys the same meaning as the more formal if he were to win, though it is less preferred in writing or formal contexts. The choice between was and were in this construction reflects a broader distinction between indicative and subjunctive moods. Were to represents a survival of the past subjunctive, and while was to is becoming more common, especially in speech, were to remain standard in contexts that demand precision and formality. Another notable variation involves subject-auxiliary inversion, where if is omitted entirely and the structure begins directly with were. This is commonly known as inverted conditional form and is typically used in formal or literary contexts. For example, the sentence "were the company to collapse, thousands of jobs would be lost" is functionally equivalent to "if the company were to collapse," but it places emphasis on the conditional clause and lends the sentence a more polished, elevated tone. This inversion not only increases stylistic variety, but also foregrounds the condition, which can be especially effective in persuasive or rhetorical writing. In this inverted construction, the auxiliary were comes before the subject, followed directly by to plus verb. The main clause follows the same modal pattern: would, could, might, etc. For instance, were she to accept the offer, we might have to revise our plans, is a formal and strategic way to express an unlikely possibility. This form is frequently used in legal, academic, and diplomatic language, where precision and rhetorical restraint are valued. Type 3. If plus past perfect plus would have plus past participle. The type 3 conditional is used to describe hypothetical situations in the past that are explicitly contrary to reality. Its structure consists of if plus past perfect in the conditional clause, followed by would have plus past participle in the main clause. This form is used to reflect on what could have happened but did not, and it often conveys a sense of regret, missed opportunity, or imagined alternatives. The past perfect in the if clause clearly signals that the condition refers to a moment that is completed and unchangeable, while the modal perfect construction in the main clause, would have plus past participle, shows a consequence that is equally impossible because the condition was not fulfilled. For example, in the sentence "if they had warned us earlier, we would have avoided the danger," the speaker imagines a different past in which the early warning occurred. The reality, however, is that no warning came, and the danger was not avoided. This conditional construction allows speakers not only to speculate, but also to evaluate past actions or inactions, and explore how events might have unfolded differently. Within this conditional framework, the expression "if I had been you" serves as a past equivalent to the more common phrase "if I were you." While the latter is used to offer advice in present hypothetical situations, "if I had been you" places the speaker in the other person's position in the past, allowing them to evaluate a past choice or action. For instance, "if I had been you, I wouldn't have accepted that offer" expresses disapproval or advice concerning a past decision, assuming the speaker had occupied the same circumstances. This usage is particularly useful for retrospective evaluation, as it combines the hypothetical perspective with the definite context of a completed past event. It may also appear in discussions of responsibility or moral reasoning, such as "if I had been you, I would have apologized," implying that the speaker believes the other person acted wrongly in a past situation. Another idiomatic and meaningful use of the type 3 conditional is the phrase "if it hadn't been for," which is employed to indicate that a specific factor or person prevented a negative outcome or made a positive one possible. This structure attributes causality to an element that was crucial in shaping the actual outcome, and then imagines how things might have turned out differently without it. For example, "if it hadn't been for the firefighter, we could have lost everything in the fire," implies that the firefighter's intervention was essential in averting a disaster. This form is powerful because it blends factual acknowledgement, "the firefighter did help," with hypothetical reasoning, "if they hadn't, the result would have been catastrophic." Similarly, "if it hadn't been for your support, I wouldn't have passed the exam," recognizes the speaker's success while attributing it directly to the other person's contribution. Like many formal constructions in conditional grammar, this phrase also appears in its inverted form, especially in more literary or elevated language, as "had it not been for," followed by the same modal perfect structure. For instance, "had it not been for his quick thinking, they might have drowned," retains the same meaning but elevates the tone. This inversion continues the tradition of subject-auxiliary inversion in formal conditionals, and allows for greater flexibility and emphasis in structuring complex or emotionally loaded statements. Type 3 Variation 1. Inversion with had. This variation involves the use of inversion with had in the if clause as a formal alternative to the standard third conditional structure. The canonical form of a type 3 conditional is if plus past perfect plus would have plus past participle, used to express unreal past conditions and their imagined consequences. However, in more formal or literary styles, the if clause can be inverted by placing had before the subject and omitting if. This creates a more concise and stylistically elevated form, while preserving the same hypothetical and counterfactual meaning. The inverted structure follows the pattern had plus subject plus past participle, which replaces the standard if plus subject plus had plus past participle. For example, the sentence had they arrived earlier, they would have caught the plane is a formal equivalent of if they had arrived earlier, they would have caught the plane. Both sentences express the same idea, that they did not arrive early, and they therefore missed the plane. But the inverted form is often used to add emphasis, rhetorical sophistication, or stylistic variation. It is particularly common in written English, especially in academic, historical, or literary narratives, where a more polished or expressive tone is desired. This variation maintains the same grammatical tense and logical structure as the standard third conditional. The past perfect remains essential in the inverted clause because it signals a completed, unreal past action. The main clause in the standard form uses would have plus past participle to indicate the hypothetical result that did not come to pass. The entire sentence thus constructs a clear contrast between reality and the imagined alternative. Inverted third conditionals are also compatible with modal verbs other than would, such as might have or could have, which allows speakers to introduce different shades of possibility, ability, or uncertainty. For instance, had she studied medicine, she might have become a surgeon, offers a tentative reflection on a past decision and its potential consequence. The use of might have instead of would have makes the outcome seem less certain or definitive, while the inversion with had lends a formal or reflective tone to the statement. This form is not typically used in casual conversation, where the full if plus past perfect clause is more common and easier to process. However, in public speaking, writing, or when aiming to produce a more elegant or rhetorically effective expression, the inverted form is often preferred. For example, in a commemorative speech, one might say, had it not been for their courage, the mission would have failed, rather than the more pedestrian, if it hadn't been for their courage. This subtle shift in formality and emphasis helps draw attention to the importance of the condition and its imagined outcome. Type 3 Variation 2. If plus past perfect plus modal plus perfect infinitive. The variation involves a structural extension of the standard third conditional by incorporating modal verbs other than would in the main clause. The typical form of the third conditional is if plus past perfect plus would have plus past participle, used to express unreal situations in the past. However, this variation replaces would have with another modal plus perfect infinitive, resulting in the structure if plus past perfect plus modal plus have plus past participle. This allows for greater semantic nuance, enabling the speaker to express not only hypothetical outcomes but also shades of possibility, ability, obligation, necessity, or permission in relation to the unreal past event. For instance, in the sentence if he had trained more seriously, he could have won the tournament, the modal verb could introduces the notion of unrealized ability. The speaker implies that success was within reach, but the condition necessary to achieve it, training more seriously, did not occur. The use of could have in the main clause thus expresses a missed potential, indicating that the outcome was possible, not certain. This differs from the more assertive would have won, which suggests a more definite hypothetical result. This distinction is important because it gives the speaker a way to modulate their degree of certainty or commitment to the imagined consequence. Similarly, in the sentence if you had told me earlier, I might have been able to help, The modal verb might conveys tentative possibility or hesitation. The speaker is not claiming definitively that they would have helped, but rather suggesting that helping could have been an option if the condition had been met. This subtle shift in modality is particularly useful in polite or emotionally complex situations where speakers want to avoid overstatement or accusations, as in expressions of regret or disappointment. Another variation of this structure can involve the modal should, which adds a sense of obligation or advisability to the imagined result. For example, if they had acted sooner, they should have prevented the accident implies that it was their responsibility to act and that, had they fulfilled that responsibility, the negative outcome could have been avoided. This usage blends hypothetical reasoning with a moral or evaluative stance, allowing the speaker not just to imagine a different past, but also to pass judgment on it. Additionally, this variation retains the past perfect in the conditional clause, since the structure always refers to a completed and unreal past event. The perfect infinitive in the main clause, i.e., have plus past participle, must follow the modal to maintain correct tense and aspect agreement. Modals such as could, might, should, and must, though less commonly, are all compatible with this construction, and each carries its own nuance. For example, if he had studied harder, he must have passed the test can imply a retrospective certainty or inference rather than a pure hypothetical, though such cases are context-dependent and may border on epistemic modality rather than conditionality. The zero conditional. It is used to talk about general truths or habitual actions that occur under certain conditions. It typically uses the present simple in both the condition and the result clause. For instance, if you heat water to 100 degrees Celsius, it boils. This type of conditional expresses cause and effect relationships that are always or usually true. Modal verbs like can or may can also be used. If you can read this, you're too close. Generic factual conditional that expresses cause and effect. The zero conditional is referred to as the generic factual condition because it is used to express situations that are always true under certain conditions. This type of conditional sentence highlights a cause and effect relationship that is universally or habitually valid, rather than being tied to a specific time, event, or individual case. In this structure, the condition presented in the if clause leads directly to a result in the main clause, and both clauses typically use the present simple tense. The zero conditional functions much like a scientific or logical principle, stating general truths or patterns of behavior that hold true whenever the condition is met. For example, the sentence, if you heat water to 100 degrees Celsius, it boils illustrates this usage perfectly. Here, the condition heating water to 100 degrees always leads to the result it boils, thus reflecting a cause, heating, and its natural effect, boiling. Similarly, the statement, if people don't drink water, they get dehydrated, outlines a general biological fact, rather than a specific situation. This conditional type is not limited strictly to the present simple. There are other present tenses such as the present perfect or present continuous, can also be used in the clauses depending on the context. For instance, if she's traveling abroad, she always calls me every evening, combines a present continuous tense in the condition clause with a habitual action in the result clause. These combinations maintain the factual, recurring nature of the relationship. The zero conditional can also include modal verbs like can or may, especially when highlighting potential results. For example, prawns can be very risky to eat if they haven't been kept at the right temperature, still follows the same logic. Under certain conditions, improper storage, there is a typical result, food risk. In this way, the sentence still reflects a cause and effect truth, but introduces a sense of potential or possibility rather than certainty. Moreover, the structure can be adapted for instructions or general rules by using imperatives in the main clause. For example, if a chip pan sets alight, throw a fire blanket over it. Not water provides a general rule of action tied to a specific condition. This is particularly common in instructional or safety language, where a predictable event leads to a recommended response. Importantly, in the zero conditional, if can also often be replaced by when without changing the meaning, as both express a repeated truth. In a sentence like if, when you press this button, the machine starts, the effect follows the condition every time, reinforcing the idea that this is not a singular event, but a general rule. In essence, the zero conditional serves to describe the world as it consistently functions. It is not about hypothetical situations, future possibilities, or past regrets, but about stating clear, factual connections between conditions and their outcomes. This makes it especially valuable for scientific facts, rules, habitual behavior, and cause and effect observations that are assumed to be true universally or regularly. Habitual factual conditional that expresses a habit that is typically true in the present. The zero conditional as a habitual factual condition refers to a specific use of this structure to express habits or typical behaviors that are generally true in the present. This form focuses not on universal truths or scientific facts, but on actions or patterns that are regularly repeated by individuals or groups under specific conditions. This condition may still express a cause, but the emphasis is more on repetition and routine rather than general laws of nature. In this use, the zero conditional maintains its basic structure of if plus present simple, followed by present simple in the main clause. However, instead of stating something that is always true in every possible situation, it conveys what typically happens when a specific condition occurs. For example, the sentence, if she's traveling abroad on business, she always phones me every evening, illustrates a habitual condition. It shows a pattern in her behavior that happens every time the condition is met. When she travels for work, she makes a call. This is not a universal truth, but rather a personal habit observed consistently in the present. This habitual use of the zero conditional is particularly useful for describing someone's routines, preferences, or predictable reactions. A sentence like, if he drinks coffee after dinner, he can't sleep exemplifies this idea. The condition, drinking coffee, leads to a result, lack of sleep. Not because it is a scientific fact applicable to all people, but because it happens regularly in that person's experience. The factual nature of the zero conditional here refers to its truth for a specific subject, based on repeated occurrences. This version of the zero conditional helps speakers describe behavioral patterns without implying any sense of uncertainty or future possibility. It does not speculate or predict. Instead, it states what is known to be true based on regular observation. Thus, it plays a key role in narratives or conversations about habits, routines, or conditions that repeatedly trigger the same response in the present. Overall, the zero conditional as a habitual factual condition captures the idea that certain actions or behaviors consistently result from specific situations. Its focus is on what typically happens, grounded in experience rather than absolute truth. It provides a way to describe the present in terms of routine, reflecting how individuals react or behave under recurring circumstances. B. A habit that was typically in the past. The zero conditional as a habitual factual condition that expresses a habit that was typically true in the past refers to a use of the zero conditional structure to describe behaviors or patterns that regularly occurred under certain conditions, but are no longer current. While the standard zero conditional is used in the present to talk about general or repeated truths, this variation shifts the time reference to the past, emphasizing routines or habits that used to happen when a specific condition was met. In this usage, both the if clause and the main clause take the past simple tense, rather than the present simple that characterizes the more typical zero conditional. This change in tense marks the habitual behavior as something that occurred in the past and has since stopped. For example, a sentence like, if we got home late, our mother always left the porch light on illustrates this type of conditional. The condition getting home late used to happen, and the result mother leaving the light on was a repeated response. The sentence does not refer to a single event, but to a recurring pattern of behavior in the past. This past-oriented habitual zero conditional can also be seen in The key function of this type of conditional is to convey past habits without using modal verbs like would or used to. While those structures are also used to express past routines, the past tense zero conditional offers a more neutral, straightforward way to describe what regularly occurred in response to certain conditions. This makes it particularly effective in storytelling, memoirs, or any context where the speaker is reflecting on how things were at a different time. The first conditional. The first conditional deals with real and possible future situations. It uses the present simple in the if clause and will plus base verb in the main clause, such as in if it rains, we'll cancel the picnic. This type expresses likely outcomes and can incorporate modals like may, can, or should to convey different nuances. Importantly, the future tense is generally avoided in the if clause unless expressing willingness, as in if he won't listen, there's nothing I can do. Open or real condition. Future situation likely to happen. The first conditional is used to express an open or real condition that refers to a future situation that is likely to happen. This type of conditional sentence is called real or open because it deals with events or situations that are not hypothetical or imaginary. They are possible and plausible outcomes based on a specific condition. The speaker believes the condition could actually occur, and if it does, the result is expected to follow. The typical structure of the first conditional is if plus present simple in the conditional clause, followed by will plus base form of the verb in the main clause. For example, in the sentence, if the weather is good tomorrow, we will have a picnic, the condition if the weather is good is realistic and can be fulfilled in the future. The result, we will have a picnic, is a likely outcome that depends on whether the condition is met. The structure clearly links the present condition with a future consequence. While the present simple is usually used in the if clause, there are other present tenses, such as the present continuous or present perfect, that can also appear depending on the context. For instance, if you're coming by train, I'll meet you at the station, uses the present continuous in the condition to reflect a future arrangement. The key point remains the same. The condition is realistic, and the result is expected to occur if the condition is fulfilled. Additionally, the result clause is not limited to will. Other future forms or modal verbs such as can, may, and should are also possible. A sentence like if you study hard, you may pass the exam still follows the first conditional logic, but introduces a degree of probability or recommendation. Another example, if the results are positive, the company is going to launch the product, shows that a planned future action hinges on a condition that is expected to be evaluated. It is important to note that the use of will in the if clause is generally considered incorrect unless it refers to willingness or refusal, as in if he won't cooperate, we'll have to find someone else. Here, won't expresses a refusal, not a future prediction. Otherwise, the standard form avoids future tenses in the if clause. The first conditional is also used for a variety of communicative purposes beyond stating future consequences. It can express offers such as, I'll call the hotel if you don't have time, or commands such as, if you arrive late, don't ring the doorbell. It can also function in suggestions, warnings, or negotiations, making it a flexible structure for real-world interactions. The second conditional. The second conditional refers to hypothetical or unlikely present or future situations. It usually consists of the past simple in the condition clause and would plus base verb in the result clause. For example, if I won the lottery, I would travel the world. This form imagines situations that are not true now or unlikely to happen. It also serves to give polite advice or express wishes and desires, as in if I were you, I'd be careful. Notably, were is used instead of was for all subjects in more formal English. An unreal situation in the present. The second conditional as an unreal situation in the present refers to a grammatical structure used to express a hypothetical or imaginary condition that is contrary to the present reality. This means that the situation described in the if clause is not actually true at the moment of speaking, but is imagined for the sake of discussion. The structure typically consists of if plus past simple in the conditional clause and would plus base verb in the main clause. This use of second conditional is important because it allows the speaker to reflect on present circumstances that are different from the actual state of things. For example, in the sentence, if I were rich, I would travel the world, the speaker is not rich now but is imagining what they would do if that were the case. The condition, if I were rich, is unreal, and the result, I would travel the world, is a hypothetical consequence. This construction is often used to express wishes, regrets, dreams, or alternative possibilities that are not true in the current moment. A distinctive feature of the second conditional is the use of were instead of was for all subjects in formal English, especially in expressions like, if I were you. This use of were is a remnant of the subjunctive mood and highlights the unreal nature of the condition. For example, if she were more confident, she would speak up in meetings suggests that she is not confident and therefore the imagined result does not happen. While was is commonly used in informal speech, if I was in charge, were remains the standard in formal writing in situations requiring precision. The second conditional also appears in expressions of politeness, advice, and hypothetical opinions. A sentence like, if you could help me with this task, I'd really appreciate it, softens a request by framing it as a hypothetical scenario. Similarly, if I were you, I'd talk to her, is a way of offering advice based on an imagined position. This conditional form is not limited to using would in the main clause. Other modal verbs such as might and could can also be used to adjust the degree of certainty or possibility. For example, if we had more time, we might go to the museum implies a possibility rather than a definite plan, while if I knew his number, I could call him suggests ability or potential under a different present condition. B. A situation that is improbable or unlikely to happen. The second conditional can be used to describe a situation that is improbable or unlikely to happen in the future, even though it is possible. This use differs slightly from the second conditional that expresses an unreal present situation, because it does not necessarily assume that the condition is entirely false, but rather that it is highly unlikely to occur. The structure remains the same. If clause takes the past simple, and the main clause uses would plus base form, or sometimes modals like might and could. In this context, the second conditional helps speakers express doubt, hesitation, or low expectation about a future event. For example, the sentence, if Mike rang the travel agent tomorrow, he might get a cancellation suggests that Mike could call tomorrow, but the speaker believes it's unlikely he actually will. The condition, if Mike rang, refers to a future action, but its use in the past tense shows that the speaker sees it as improbable. This use contrasts with the first conditional, which is used when the speaker believes the condition is likely. For instance, if Mike rings the travel agent tomorrow, he might get a cancellation reflects a higher degree of belief in the possibility. The choice between the first and second conditionals depends not on grammar alone but on the speaker's perception of probability. The first suggests a real possibility, the second suggests that while the condition is technically possible, the speaker doubts it will happen. In this use of the second conditional, the past simple in the if clause does not indicate past time but rather serves as a grammatical marker of hypotheticality or distance from reality. It allows the speaker to soften the certainty of the condition, creating a more speculative tone. For example, if I won the lottery, I'd buy a house by the sea, expresses a distant, highly unlikely scenario, even if not entirely impossible. This version of the second conditional is also useful for expressing cautious plans or ideas, especially when the speaker wants to entertain possibilities without showing too much confidence or commitment. In sentences like, if we moved to the countryside, we'd live a quieter life, the speaker entertains the idea but signals that it's not a serious or likely plan at the moment. The third conditional. The third conditional deals with unreal situations in the past, things that did not happen. The structure is if plus past perfect in the condition clause and would have plus past participle in the result clause. For example, if I had studied harder, I would have passed the exam. It is used to express regrets or criticize past decisions, as in you could have avoided this if you had listened. 1. Imagined condition. A hypothetical past situation impossible to happen, contrary to fact. The third conditional is used to express an imagined or hypothetical condition in the past, something that did not happen but is being considered as if it had. This type of conditional constructs a scenario that is entirely impossible to change because it refers to a past situation that is already over and known to be untrue. The third conditional allows speakers to reflect on alternative outcomes that might have occurred if circumstances had been different. The standard grammatical structure of the third conditional is if plus past perfect in the conditional clause, followed by would have plus past participle in the main clause. For example, in the sentence if I had studied harder, I would have passed the exam expresses a past event that did not happen. The speaker did not study hard and as a result they did not pass. The sentence imagines a different past one in which studying harder could have led to success, but acknowledges that this is only a hypothetical reconstruction. This conditional is used not only to imagine different outcomes, but also to express regret, criticism, or missed opportunities. For instance, if you had listened to me, we wouldn't have gotten lost implies a reproach. Something went wrong, and the speaker believes it could have been avoided. It is a way to comment on the past with the benefit of hindsight. Modals like might or could can replace would in the main clause to adjust the degree of certainty. A sentence like if she had left earlier, she might have caught the train shows that catching the train was a possibility, not a guaranteed outcome, if the condition had been met. This flexibility allows for varying tones, from definite to tentative, while still remaining within the realm of hypothetical past events. Additionally, it is noted that in some cases, particularly in American English, it is possible to use would have in both clauses, as in if the play would have finished on time, we wouldn't have missed the train. However, this usage is often discouraged in British English, where the traditional if plus past perfect form is preferred. If the play had finished on time. The third conditional can also be used in more literary or formal styles by inverting the auxiliary verb and the subject in the if clause, omitting if. For example, had we known about the delay, we would have changed our plans has the same meaning as if we had known about the delay, but carries a more elevated tone. Mixed conditionals. Mixed conditionals are a type of conditional sentence that combine elements from different conditional patterns, typically blending time references between the past and the present or future. While standard conditionals maintain the same time frame in both the if clause and the main clause, mixed conditionals break this symmetry. They create a logical relationship between the condition in one time frame and a result in another, allowing for more nuanced expressions of hypothetical meaning. One common type is the second/third conditional, which describes a present unreal condition that would have affected the past. In this case, the if clause uses the past simple like in the second conditional to express a present situation that is not true, while the main clause uses would have plus past participle, like in the third conditional, to imagine a different past result. For example, if the island were still a tourist attraction, last week's earthquake would have caused more deaths. Imagines that the island is not a tourist spot anymore, present condition, and because of that, the past earthquake caused fewer casualties than it might have. The second common pattern is the third/second conditional, which works in the opposite direction. It starts with a past unreal condition and links it to a present unreal result. The if clause uses the past perfect, as in the third conditional, to refer to a situation that didn't happen in the past, and the main clause uses would plus base verb, as in the second conditional, to show its ongoing effect in the present. An example would be, if Fleming hadn't discovered penicillin, there would be far more fatalities every year than there actually are. Here, the condition, Fleming not discovering penicillin, is a past event that did not happen, and the consequences imagined as a current state of the world that would be different today. Mixed conditionals are especially useful when speakers want to express how past actions affect the present, or how present situations could have changed past outcomes. They help convey complex thoughts that go beyond simple cause and effect within a single time frame. These structures reflect a more advanced understanding of how time and possibility interact in hypothetical thinking. There are several alternative structures that express conditional meaning beyond the standard use of if. These alternatives serve to convey the same logical relationship between a condition and a result, but they add stylistic variety, degrees of formality, or emphasis to the expression. These structures are especially useful in formal, rhetorical, or conversational contexts, and they can replace or supplement typical conditional clauses while preserving the hypothetical or real conditional logic. One of the most common alternatives to if is the use of unless, which introduces a negative condition. It is generally equivalent to if not or only if. For example, unless you have a ticket, you won't be allowed in means the same as if you don't have a ticket, you won't be allowed in. Unless is generally used with present or future real conditions, but it cannot always replace if not, especially when the negative condition is contrary to known facts, or in most questions, where if not is required. For instance, you'd be happier if you didn't have such high expectations cannot be written as you'd be happier unless you had such high expectations, because the condition is already negated and hypothetical. Another group of alternatives consists of expressions that emphasize necessary conditions, such as provided that, providing that, so long as, and on the condition that. These phrases all mean only if, and they are used to make the conditional relationship more explicit or formal. For example, you can borrow my car provided that you return it by 6 p.m., or we'll approve the application on the condition that all forms are completed. These alternatives typically appear in first conditionals, expressing real future conditions. They cannot be used with third conditionals, since their meaning is inherently tied to the present or future. To express a past necessary condition, the phrase but for is commonly used. This structure means if it hadn't been for, and is often followed by a noun phrase. For example, they would have died, but for the doctor's quick action, suggests that the quick action was the condition that prevented a fatal outcome. This construction helps convey causality in a more concise and formal way, often used in historical or dramatic narratives. Imaginary conditions, especially in speculative or informal contexts, can be introduced with suppose, supposing that, and what if. These phrases invite the listener to consider a hypothetical scenario and may or may not include a result clause. For instance, suppose he lost the keys, what would we do? Or what if the money doesn't arrive on time? These expressions are flexible in tone and allow speakers to explore possibilities or raise doubts without needing a full conditional sentence. Often, the main clause is omitted, especially in casual conversation. There is also a distinction between if and in case, which may seem similar but serve different functions. If introduces a condition that must be met for something else to happen, whereas in case introduces a precaution or a possible situation that may or may not occur. For example, take an umbrella if it rains implies that you should take the umbrella only if rain happens. In contrast, take an umbrella in case it rains suggests taking the umbrella now as a precaution against the possibility of rain. Similarly, in case of is a formal version typically used with nouns, as in case of fire, use the stairs. Another structure is even if, which is used to introduce a condition that is unexpected or unlikely, but where the result still holds regardless. For example, even if it rains, we're going ahead with the event, means that rain will not prevent the action from happening. It emphasizes the irrelevance of the condition to the outcome and often strengthens the speaker's determination or confidence. Lastly, whether or not is used to present alternative conditions, meaning the result applies in both cases. This form is suitable for all types of conditional patterns. For example, we'll go hiking whether it rains or not indicates that the action is not dependent on the condition and will occur regardless.